And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to part two of my discussion with Joshua City from 86Boxing. Someone beeping in the background. Don't worry that. I live in the city. Me and 86Boxing just talking a little bit about the great Black Panther Harry Wills. And welcome, Josh. What's up, brother?
Hey, how's it going, Random? All just good, just hanging in here. Always good to talk about the history, of course, as I mentioned, and definitely the great Black Panther Harry Wills. Certainly an underrated fighter and one who goes unmentioned at times when we think about the great heavyweights of the past. But hopefully, with guys like yourself shedding light on him, it continues to help develop and push out what this man was able to accomplish.
Yeah, man, it's great to have you. Have a little bit more of a discussion. We ran out of time last time. I'm on a pretty crazy person schedule, so we're just fitting this in, folks, when we can. This is definitely recreational on my part. So in part one, we sort of went through, and I have to correct myself from the first episode. I said that um, his first fight outside of New Orleans happened, I think, in 14, but it actually wasn't. I think his debut was in Chicago. I'm sure there's a deeper story there
Yeah.
about the beginning of his career. You had mentioned when he picked up a manager that that knew what was going on. Maybe that was the point. Again, it's hard to know just how many fights some of these guys have early in their careers. I'm not, Wills is a little bit after, say, the Langfords and Gans and some of these guys who were fighting in private a lot as well. So it's like almost impossible to know. But yeah, definitely, we touched on his debut in 11 and then his work through 12 and 13 and, his initial like top of the line opponents where he fought the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark in 13, Joe Jeanette in 13, and then we moved through his epic 1914 where he drew and lost to the great Sam Langford, who had been the top contender to Johnson. He was one of the top guys contending for wanting to contend for Johnson's world title. He drew with the great Joe Jeanette and lost to Sam McVeigh. And then in 15, he got a win over Langford. He lost to McVeigh and then also beat Battling Jim. We got through all of that. We did get through 16, where he's fighting different cities. He fights Jeff Clark. He's fighting Langford multiple times. I mean, this guy's putting the work in, fights Big Bill Tate. And then through 17, he gets the injury loss. He hurts his wrist, I believe, against Battling Jim Johnson, who was just huge, almost a brawler, but seriously tough guy and the giant, one of the biggest heavyweights in the game at that time. And then he gets another win over Langford, Langford, a draw, and then Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, yet again. He really had great success against Jeff Clark, who'd given some very talented fighters trouble because of his mobility, jabber mover. And then we reached roughly his run through in Panama City at the end of 17 and through 18. And then his return to the States, where he beats the Joplin Ghost yet again, and then Jack Thompson and won and drew with him. And we kind of had to call it 1919. This was an epic year for boxing. This year, the great Harry Greb went 45-0, which is, quite possibly the greatest season in the history of the sport. But, as far as Wills, a lot happened at heavyweight in 1919. Can you sort of touch on that, Josh?
Yes, indeed. Of course, with Harry Wills, he was making his run, and at this particular point, he was starting to become one of the clear top heavyweights that was out there, especially when you think about the black fighters that were taking on each other at that particular time. It was around this time in which Will started to stand out as being the best heavyweight of them. And as you'll see there, he'll have fights and wins with the likes of Langford, with the likes of McVeigh, as well as Joe Jeanette. Each of these guys always regarded as some of the best, not only from their time, but just in the history of the sport. So, of course, with that comes fanfare, comes chatter. And it just so happens that in 1919, that was an iconic year, as you mentioned, not only for what Harry Greb did, but this was also the year that boxing got its next heavyweight star and probably one of the biggest mega stars, rather, that the sport and just the world of celebrity in general had ever seen. And this was Jack Dempsey. It just so happened to be 1919 when he defeated Jess Willard, Toledo, Ohio. And of course, I'm sure if you're familiar with Jack Dempsey, you're probably familiar with the footage that is out there of him absolutely blitzing Jess Willard at this particular time. I mean, it's probably one of the most iconic one rounders, at least. It went 4 rounds, but that first round is just probably one of the most iconic that you'll ever see on film as it relates to boxing history, especially dating back to this time. And it's amazing that we actually have that footage. But of course, as you know, this was Jack Dempsey's arrival. He had been making waves. Started out as Kid Blackie. He was a hobo who traveled from here and there to take on anyone for whatever money. And he built up his name facing some of the top guys that were out there at the time. Uh, he took a couple of losses, learned from them. And he was really a knockout artist in a sense, and we were able to see that on display in full effect when he took on Jess Willard. And Willard, of course, as I've mentioned before, this was one of those David versus Goliath matchups. Willard 6'6" plus, 240 pounds. I mean, he's just a big guy, not superbly skilled. Of course, he got a late start in the sport, but he was big, tough, could take a punch, and had endurance. And those were probably his strong suits at that particular time. And Jack Dempsey, he went in and essentially blitzed him. And I would say, just looking back, this is probably one of the first instances of us seeing this on film. Of course, there were fights from the past, but when you think about some of the heavyweight fights that we got on film, of course, this came after Jack Johnson, what he was able to do after Willard beating Johnson, so on and so forth. Just James J. Jeffries, who we have on film. We have a little bit of film of him actually in contests. But that being said, this Jack Dempsey film of taking out Willard, this was a game changer for those that are just fans of the history of boxing. And this turned out to be a game changer for the boxing public as well. And this made Dempsey become essentially a star overnight. And this would just continue to grow. The myth, the story, the aura of Dempsey would continue to grow from there. So 1919 was his coming out party in a sense. And he became champion, and that ushered in a new style of champion, at least for the public that was watching at that particular time, because we know that Jess Willard, he didn't have an impressive run there as the heavyweight champion. And prior to him, it was Jack Johnson. And as heavyweight champion, his run wasn't very impressive, at least from a viewing perspective. And we didn't really see him taking on the best opponents that were available at that particular time. And then even uh, prior to that, you of course you had Tommy Burns, and you had, of course, James Jeffries. I think Marvin Hart was in the mix there. But really, for Jack Dempsey to be able to pick up the title, this was just the makings of something major for the sport. And had it not been at that particular time, and had it not gone down the way that it did, then who knows? History could have been different. But it was just the perfect time and the perfect fighter, at least, for ushering in this style of offensive uh, punch first, foot forward, knockout heavyweight. And it was a big thing at that particular time. And And of course, as time went on, it continued to be something that we looked for in an actual heavyweight. So this just so happened to coincide with Willard or Wills rather coming into his own as a heavyweight. So naturally, you would get those calls that this would potentially be the matchup that the boxing public and world would want to see. And it wasn't it wasn't just something that came out of the blue. Wills had to go through the run that he did to be able to up his stock in the public's eye. And if you look at articles, newspapers from the time, many, many of those that were journalists who were writing these articles at the time viewed Wills as the legitimate threat for Jack Dempsey at that particular time. It became a situation where there was no doubt that the two best heavyweights in the world over this period was Jack Dempsey and Harry Wills. And with that taken into account, that started the clamoring, that started the chants, and that started the want and need for this matchup to happen. And I mentioned in the video I just did on Harry Wills that, I found articles dating back to 1918 where they were speaking on it and sort of speaking this fight into existence, this being the matchup that the people needed, that the boxing world wanted to see. And I even mentioned in the video that, yeah, they're likely that there may have been some who were calling for it beforehand, but I think 18 is probably a key time frame because of the fact that it was from this point that Harry Wills started to just become dominant, and not even the great Sam Langford, who was getting up in years and fights, he could no longer defeat Harry Wills from this point. Uh, and I mean, you see what's on the screen. It just shows you the type of run that he was going on from 1918 through 1919. And you think about Langford, he was still a feared heavyweight at that particular time, even as he was getting up there, because he was still a puncher, and that's one of his traits that carried with him from the lower weights. Langford being one of the few, and I think this is where many people tend to sort of see that separation between Langford and some of the other great weight movers of the past. When it came to Langford, yeah, he was knocking out guys much bigger than him at heavyweight. Same thing as he just came up from light heavyweight, middleweight, etc. So it was similar in nature to how we kind of got witness of the great Bob Fitzsimmons as he was making his way up the ranks. But for Langford, it was at an even higher degree. And it was in many, many more fights. And he was knocking out some of these guys who were the top competition of the day multiple times. And it's just a staggering amount of fights that he ultimately ended up having. So I think that played into it as well. And Harry Wills, he was on the back end of this as well. Early on, as he started to box, yes, he was knocked out by Langford as well. And we see he eventually reached that point where not even the great Sam Langford could defeat him. And this, along with the guys like McVeigh, along with Joe Jeanette. And I think this certainly is what helped to elevate him and put him in place where we had those calling for him to take on Jack Dempsey. And from my perspective, I think it probably would have ended up being one of the great fights in history just because of the fact that they matched up so well stylistically. You had Dempsey, who was this guy who was rugged. He'd come in with his crouching, come forward styles, looking for offense. Wills was a guy who was slightly bigger. He was a little bit bigger than Dempsey from a height perspective. And he had he was a bigger from weight, just overall size and girth as well. But they matched up very, very well. Dempsey's about 6'1", Wills 6'2", uh, and stylistically, Wills, he could work behind the jab, but he was an athletic fighter as well, and he had a knockout punch. Certainly, that would have been on display, and you'd have had these two offensive forces clashing. I believe in Dempsey's 53 wins. Thinking off top, he had 43 knockouts in those 53 wins. And with Wills, he had, I want to say it was 56 knockouts in his 70 wins. So it just had the makings of something big and magnificent on the offensive end. And that was something, as far as heavyweight championship fight, we hadn't really seen in a long time. You'd probably have to go back to, as far as prior to Dempsey picking up the title, at least, you'd probably have to go back to, I want to say maybe Jeffries and Fitzsimmons, but then
Yeah, I was gonna
again,
say that.
yeah, yeah. Maybe Jeffries, Fitzsimmons. Then again, Jeffries, he was a much bigger guy than Fitzsimmons, just from a overall size and mass standpoint. But he was able to, stop Fitzsimmons, of course. Same with Jim Corbett. But yeah, that was probably one where you had some offensive power going, but I don't think anything to that degree, or to the degree of what it would have been had it been Wills versus Dempsey, would have been seen, or there hadn't been anything at that point that could have really matched that. From a world heavyweight championships fight perspective, you'd have to probably go back to the age of bare knuckles. This just was one of those marquee stylistic matchups that would have been great. Now, of course, there were opportunities for those types of fights that happened in the past, but of course, we didn't get those prior to Dempsey versus Wills becoming a potential matchup. And of course, as we know, and as the story goes on, we know that, of course, this kind of fell into that same historic, and we even see it today, that sort of stain in boxing, where you have these potential matchups where you get two guys who are in the same weight division and are arguably the best fighters in the sport at the time, or at least, if we were looking at it from a top 10 rating standpoint, and they weren't necessarily rating at that particular time, but these two in all likelihood would have been in that top 10, and you would have had these two guys in the same division. And we've seen how that has been over the years, and this was the same case here, where ultimately, man, just the sport, it needed this fight, and it was calling for this fight. And it seems like, when you have those fights that are being called for the most, that's when a lot of the political stuff, all the things on the side, seems to rear their ugly heads in a way to try and prevent this matchup from actually taking place. And this usually goes on for a number of years, as we're witnessing sort of with some of the big fights we want to see right now. And it's even more of an apparent thing when it comes to the heavyweight division, because historically it has always been the heavyweight division that has been the marquee division, the mover, the mover as far as boxing is concerned, and the division that really brings in the most eyes, and brings in the most fanfare, the most media. It's the heavyweight division that has always been that driver, even despite, of course, we've seen years, especially here, more in modern times, where you've had some of the lower weights really kind of prop up and carry the sport in that sense. But once you get a top level heavyweight or group of them out there, that always crops up and just kind of surpasses that, and that becomes what the sport, what the media and everything gravitates towards. And that was the case here with Wills and Dempsey. And so, yeah, upon Dempsey winning that title in 1919, we seem to be pushing towards that trajectory of us getting that potential matchup. And of course, with the heavyweight title, it should be noted, especially in those times, comes a lot of other things, a level of stardom, a level of mega stardom, even that is unlike anything that was just widely there in other sports. You had the likes of Babe Ruth, and I believe Red Granger, someone that is often mentioned around those times. But essentially, when you became heavyweight champion, so much other stuff started calling, and some of that crept into the mix as far as this potential Wills versus Dempsey fight, with Dempsey himself, starting to get more into movies as those years went on. Started to see him with Charlie Chaplin, his wife, I believe at the time, or fiance, Estelle Taylor, who I'm thinking of. I can't remember I believe they were ultimately engaged or maybe married at some point, but she was a star in that whole world of what we consider Hollywood, I guess you can say. So a lot of that starts to come in as well, and then priorities start to shift, and when it all boils down to it, uh, how I was speaking of the likes of Willard not having a strong run at heavyweight, as well as Jack Johnson, and then some before him. When it came to Dempsey, we didn't get all of the fights that would have been the best fights in the sport, even though we did get some iconic fights from Dempsey as a heavyweight champion. Of course, his fight with Luis Angel Firpo, drag him out, knock him down, just blitz of an affair there early on. Of course, his Carpentier fight, massive fight, changed the game in terms of radio broadcasting, the amount of money generated at the gate. Of course, we know the iconic fights with the likes of Gene Tunney. I mean, the long count fight that turned out to be a controversial fight, and a fight that's still talked about to this very day and just gets passed on from generation to generation. Those are all iconic fights. But certainly, this Wills versus Dempsey fight would have been the matchup of the two best heavyweights at that particular time. And these would have been two guys who were naturally heavyweights. Of course, we know Carpentier was really a light heavyweight. And even with the likes of Gene Tunney, he really applied his trade primarily at light heavyweight, and of course moved to heavyweight. And in those fights, while iconic, yeah, Dempsey at that particular time, of course, wasn't fighting at that same pace or with that same veracity from the standpoint of that same hunger that he had in 1919, which I guess you can expect when all the money comes knocking at the door and all of that stuff. But um, certainly by 1918, then moving forward, as Dempsey was the champion, this was the fight that we, the public, needed. And it's still a fight that is one of those that, if you think about the potential greatest matchups that never happened, Wills Dempsey has to be right up there high in the mix.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. Well put. I think you can see like at the Wills had shown that he could dominate against the guys who were the three of the four fearsome foursome. Basically, you got Johnson, McVeigh, Langford, and Jeanette were the four best overall heavyweights, of the decade. And Wills came in, but by the end of the decade, he was the man. You can see in his 1918, he gets the best of McVeigh, Langford, McVeigh, and also the Joplin Ghost Jeff Clark, who was very, had 116 wins, 15 draws against just 17 losses, and an insanely difficult resume himself. Not a Hall of Famer, probably should be. mean, he's one of the few guys who got a win over the prime Sam Langford. That's pretty intense. But I think, Wills had shown by this point that he was the guy. And he going into 1919, Greb had a phenomenal year. He wanted Dempsey. Wills had a phenomenal year. He would have wanted Dempsey. Those are two fights that didn't happen. Harry Greb was fighting a ridiculous schedule. I can't remember his exact record in 1920. In 1919, he went 45-0, and then in 1920, I think Greb went something like 24-2, or 22-1. I think he won and lost against Gibbons, or lost and then avenged the defeat. But Dempsey was making that money, like you said. The money was there for him. So, but the other hungry guys who are fighting the schedule, who in a just sport would, minus all the draw of entertainment, the easy money, which has happened to every champ. Every champ was like, oh, you mean I can get paid the kinds of purses I used to get, like way back in the day, just for showing up to a place, have some drinks with people and say a few words or talk about fights? Like, come on now. So guys cash in, but the contenders, and Wills sort of inherited that spot of like McVeigh, Langford, and Jeanette, where he just couldn't get a shot. Johnson didn't want to know. Willard didn't want to know. And then Dempsey didn't want to know. Tunney didn't want to know. Nobody wanted to, because after Johnson, there were race riots in the U.S. After Johnson won the world title. I mean, I'm sorry, after he beat Jeffries, the undefeated champ, came out of retirement, and this sort of like the whole lineage was on the line. And so there was, it was like Joe Louis got the next shot. After that, that was the kind of leap. So a great fighter like Wills wasn't going to get his opportunity. Lots of excuses. Color line was just a feeble excuse. They just didn't want to know. And there's sort of the myth that like no one would promote it, but overseas promoters were offering up big purses, and certain promoters in the States were offering up big purses for some of these top fights. There was just a lot of excuses made. Just like today, guys make all their excuses. They won't make the big fights. But I remember when Joe Calzaghe and Roy Jones Jr. wanted to fight each other, they agreed via text. They were like 50-50. All right, then. And that was it. And they made the fight. So sometimes fights between notable fighters can just happen if both guys are committed and they have enough control over their careers, and they tell their people what to do, or they just do it themselves. So, but Wills was like, he was in that spot, and that continued on. So you see so like you look at this run, this isn't like over years and years, like now where they just fight a couple times a year. So busy 1918 undefeated, busy 1919 undefeated, busy 1920 and 21 undefeated. And it's just like, and other guys were in the, as you know, Josh, other guys were in the running too. Like Langford wasn't gone. He was far from gone. So say 1920, let me pull this up. I've got it somewhere. Yeah, look at Langford's 1920, even way past his prime. He got injured one eye permanently against Fred Fulton in 1917. Look at that. I think there's only maybe, 4 losses in that whole lot? So that was like his comeback year. There he is in 1920. He's a little tank. Look at that little dude over there on the far right. And he was a puncher. He was one of the greatest punchers in history. Just like Fitz, just like other great punchers, if they're clever and have technique, just like Fitz, just like Langford, even giving up size past their prime, they can beat most people. So Langford wanted a shot, couldn't get it. Wills wanted a shot, couldn't get it. Just so it's a lot of unfairness. But if you just go by resume, Langford and, among the heavyweights, Langford and Wills, yeah, amongst any weight across all of history, Langford's resume is just silly. There really are only a handful of guys who even come close to, as far as the level of sustained opposition. But Wills really put it on. He took over from the guys who were being avoided by beating all the guys who were being avoided. Like, so he became that guy. And sometimes the better fighter doesn't get the opportunity in this time, or the person who's more proven. Like it gets to the point where Wills has a better resume than Dempsey, and he can't get a shot against Dempsey. Just like Langford had a better resume than Johnson, couldn't get a shot against Johnson. If you look at the overall level of competition, Langford obviously fought up through the weights, but he was fighting, his first full season. He had one pro fight the year before, but 1903, he closed out the year fighting an all-time great, Joe Gans, and another great fighter that time, Jack Blackburn. That was his first full year. Like, that's crazy. 1903, 1904, 1905, 1906, 1907, 1908, 1909, 1910, 1911, 1912, 1913, 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921, 1922, 1923, 1924, 1925, 1926, 1927, 1928, 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936, 1937, 1938, 1939, 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945, 1946, 1947, 1948, 1949, 1950, 1951, 1952, 1953, 1954, 1955, 1956, 1957, 1958, 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971, 1972, 1973, 1974, 1975, 1976, 1977, 1978, 1979, 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991, 19 But it only took Wills a few years before he was fighting at the highest levels, although he was a career heavyweight, unlike Langford. But yeah, Wills couldn't get a thing. So as you're moving through and you're seeing all these, a lot of these contenders are winning the fights you'd want to see the champion fight and win. And sometimes they're duplicating victories that other guys had. Like you see in 1920, he beats the crap out of Fred Fulton. Fulton was another contender of this time, but he's like some of these contenders, just like Langford had done with Johnson, they're beating the same people that the other guy's beating, but they can't get their world opportunity. But the resume, for people who study the history of the sport, it's not just about a championship lineage. It's like who's beating who's putting in the work. Just like today, that some of these champions are very inactive. They're going to be ranked the way people rank in the ring ratings initially. They didn't automatically have the champion number one. It was just a 1 through 10 for a few years. Then they did a 1 through 15 for I think 1 or 2 years, and then they started doing champion and then the top 10 contenders. So those rankings evolved over that through the 20s. They evolved. But this, Wills, this is all pre-rating era. But this was the fight. He couldn't get it, but he's beating all these guys. And at the same exact time, Harry Greb is beating all these guys, although he's doing it middleweight, light heavy, and heavyweight. These guys are calling for Dempsey and couldn't get it. So Dempsey was iconic. He was a huge draw and a huge star, and it was good for boxing overall, that in the realm of money making and prestige. But at the same time, these guys didn't get their opportunity. Although Wills was good with his money, he did make money. You could make good money without being the champion. People still want to see you fight, and if you're a top guy, they want to see it. So, do you have anything to add on these years here as we get into Dempsey's reign? I'll pull up the next slide.
Well, yeah, one of the things I was just going to say, really, as it related to Dempsey, and you kind of pointed it out there briefly, was we're talking about Harry Wills, of course, but it wasn't just Harry Wills, even as you mentioned, who was being sought for a shot and who the media was actually calling for to take on Dempsey. You mentioned Harry Greb. He was another one that was out there who you would think being a smaller guy would be someone that Dempsey would take on, which he did with Carpentier. Of course, he actually sparred with Harry Greb at one point. Sorry, drew a blank there for a minute, but yeah, he actually sparred with Harry Greb, and from there, even though there was some backing for that fight, even, and if I recall correctly, I believe Harry Greb even he had the money ready to go. They were ready to do it in Pittsburgh. They were going to have a stadium built, all that good stuff, and knowing what Greb was capable of, even being one of those smaller fighters coming up, even a fight with Greb didn't materialize at that particular time for Jack Dempsey. So he was calling for it. And of course, you mentioned Sam Langford, who, as you alluded to, was someone who, while he was on the back end of his career, he was still a very formidable fighter. He was still knocking out guys, and he was still someone who would give the top heavyweights some trouble, even though Harry Wills was defeating Langford. It wasn't a case where he was just blasting through Langford in a similar capacity to the way a prime Langford was doing. A lot of these other fighters just knocking them out left and right. In this case, Wills was, of course, he's a bigger guy in general, but he was able to defeat Langford. A lot of these were, if I'm not mistaken, maybe the majority of them, if not all of them, were decisions. And this was something that was worth noting, because even Langford, as he was getting on up there at this stage of his career, he was still formidable. And there are quotes out there, and you've seen them, or if you study the history, you've probably seen them, where we know that this was a fight that was not going to be made because of the danger that Langford brought, even with one eye and sort of being on his last leg as it relates to his standing in his career. He was still a major threat at that particular time. So that's very much where the money piece of it kind of came into play, and a lot with what you see. Sometimes it comes down to legacy. You have those guys who are about the legacy piece of it, but you do have those champions who build up their legacy, and then once they get to that championship stage, then it's more of the financial, and no foul to them as far as wanting to get the most money that they can get, uh, once they get to that stage or get to where they are able to actually be the breadwinner and be the one that dictates everything. So, I mean, you can't knock them in that sense, but certainly this does creep in, and it prevents some of these other big fights from being made. So that's just something I wanted to note for sure. Uh, and you had touched on it. And, but yeah, outside of that, of course, yeah, as we got to the 1920, 1921 time frame, as it relates to Harry Wills, at this point, it was just for him, at least in his mind and in the public's mind, it was just a matter of time before the Dempsey fight would be made. So he just kept gunning. You mentioned Fred Fulton. That just so happened to be someone that helped to sort of elevate Dempsey, and put him on the map in a sense. When he was able to knock out Fred Fulton, I believe it was 2 years prior. Actually, it was 1918. If I'm not mistaken, it was probably almost exactly 2 years to the date of this actual fight here on July 26, 1920, between Wills and Fred Fulton. And Harry Wills blasted Fred Fulton as well. And Fulton, I mentioned in my video, he's a big guy, 6'5", 84.5-inch reach. And he was one of the bigger punchers of the time there in the heavyweight division and just in the sport in general. And when it came to him and Wills, much like him and Dempsey, he was knocked out because they blasted through him offensively. And I know for Wills, he knew the stakes. He knew that from this point, with his name being out there and mentioning amongst the names that was in line to face Dipsy, then he didn't have the ability to have a bad night. Really, he had to have a great showing pretty much every night. Every night out, uh, and of course that can be a gift and a curse in a sense, because if you look too good, of course, then that pushes guys a little bit further away from you as far as wanting to put their title up against you, with the potential of a loss just being there in general, because you never know what happens in the sport. But there's no doubt about it that it was obvious that I'd imagine it was pretty obvious to Dempsey that Wills was the supreme threat at that particular time to taking the title from him. So, of course, to get that fight made, it wasn't going to be as easy as him doing something with another fighter out there who was lesser. And I think that kind of played into it as well. Not only, and I won't put it all on Dempsey. Some of it was those that manage him. Like he was being managed by Doc Kearns at the time, and there were a lot of articles out there where Doc Kearns even went on the record saying he didn't want the fight, and he would use what I call excuses in saying that the public didn't want the fight, or he didn't think the fight would have the demand or make the money that some other fights may have made. And I think a lot of that was just kind of a tactic to try to avoid the fight with Wills, because, of course, as and of course, as Random has mentioned, there's no question that he was going to be the biggest threat for him, as we got into 1920, 1921 time frame. There's no question that the biggest threat at that particular time was, without a doubt, Harry Wills. Just as some of those other guys were still threats. We still had Langford out there. grab even, but the biggest threat was no doubt going to be Harry Wills. And of course, you would get those excuses. Even Tex Rickard, he didn't want to actually do the fight or didn't want to promote it because, as Random had alluded to, he brought up the Jack Johnson versus Jeffries fight and how there were race riots and things of that nature. But eventually, the public cause become bigger, and you're seeing all these newspaper articles because as some of those years went on, even Tex Rickard came around and became amendable to it. But around that time frame of 1922, I want to say, which was one of the closest points. They had a promoter by the name of William A. Brady who was out there who actually put up $200,000. He was ready to make the fight, and the split was going to be 150,000 for Dempsey and 50,000 for Wills. So the money was there even at that particular point, and it still didn't happen. So in between some of these years, we started to get to a point where, as time went on, we were seeing less and less of Dempsey, and therefore, of course, that's going to affect a fighter like Wills, who should be the next person in line, but it's not like he can just sit and just essentially wait on Dempsey with no real commitment. So for Wills, he just continued to fight. We see his 1922 there. He continued to do his thing. He fought Bill Tate, who was a guy who sparred with Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey used him as a sparring partner. So best believe that fight between Tate and Wills, that was for a particular reason, because this was someone that Dempsey had used as a sparring partner. Big guy, another big guy, about 6'6.5". He was in that like 240-pound range, relatively somewhere around there. So you have Wills go up against this guy. Of course, we see he was still in there with the likes of Sam Langford, who was still going strong. I mean, look at that, 172, 35, and 44. That's a thing of legends right there. Those are records you just don't see anymore, and you'll likely never see again. But Sam Langford's still going strong. And, of course, Wills was, hey, at this point, he couldn't defeat Wills. Wills was younger, just too much of a force at that particular time for him to be able to do anything with. And Kid Norfolk, he was a guy who probably applied a lot of his best work at the light heavyweight in that sort of weight range, but he also went up and fought heavyweights. He fought Big Bill Tate. Imagine that. With Norfolk, who's someone who's under 6 foot, he fought this 6'6.5" sort of behemoth at the time. Bill Tate wasn't supremely skilled, but a big, strong guy. But that being said, when he went up with Wills, he wasn't able to do anything with Wills, who was pretty much, I mean, these years between like 1918, 1922, if you think about Harry Wills, those are probably the years in which he was the best heavyweight in the world. Outside of Dempsey, if you want to say that Dempsey was the best heavyweight as far as having the world heavyweight title, then I can understand that. But if you just look at it on the scale of who they were fighting at that particular time, and with Jeanette, McVeigh, and Langford sort of moving into the twilights of their career, Harry Wills had a legitimate claim to being the best heavyweight in the world, probably from that 1918 to 1922 time frame. And of course, this played into him not getting the opportunity with Dempsey, I'm sure, as mentioned. And even if it's not Dempsey directly, but those around him, they probably knew this as well. Of course, you could hear it at that particular time. We didn't have social media and all that stuff, but we did have the old school media, which was the newspapers, telegrams, and all of that stuff. So there was no question that Dempsey and his team, they were hearing the chatter. They knew that Wills was the premier threat for him at that particular time. So there was no rush for them to get into that, get into those, or to get into negotiating that particular fight. I believe it's because, of course, he is the legitimate threat. And then from, I know it's from a particular period. I believe it might have been from 1918, but you see Jeff Clark there. Eventually, it got to the point where every time Wills fought Jeff Clark, he would knock them out. As you mentioned, a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, fought some of the best heavyweights and non-heavyweights in boxing history. It got to a point where even Clark couldn't compete with Harry Wills. He would get knocked out every time he fought him. There on the last 6 times they fought, as a matter of fact, they were all knockout wins for Harry Wills because Clark was no longer able to do anything with Wills. And that just shows you he was just at the peak of his physical abilities. This slide here, and I'm kind of going from down to up, but he ended up fighting Denver Ed Martin in what turned out to be Denver Ed Martin's last fight. Former colored world heavyweight champion, and Wills absolutely blasted through Martin, sent him to retirement. So if he had any hopes of doing anything there forward after facing Wills, I'm sure he understood that it was going to be a tough task in that sense. So he actually ended him. You see, he has a win over Gunboat Smith. This was another guy who was one of those heavyweights who he probably doesn't get a lot of mainstream mention, but he fought a lot of the top guys of that era, and he would give them fights for sure. But in the case of Harry Wills, he blasted through him really. As you see, it's a 1-round fight. He actually caught him with a body shot that sent him down there in the first, and it wasn't really much of a fight in actuality. So at this particular time, it was just tough sledding for anyone who stepped in the ring with Harry Wills. And I believe that in itself is the reason that, in addition to maybe Dempsey not necessarily being the direct reason for the fight, I think his people and his handlers, they knew how much of a threat Wills was to his title. And of course, for every boxer, there's usually some other people who's involved. While there's one person in the ring, on the back end, there are others who are getting money and, of course, living this life of a heavyweight champion in their own sense as well. And that is something you certainly probably don't want to lose grasp of, or lose a grip on, having that type of or being in that type of situation. So certainly, while Wills was the premier guy for them to face, it was a challenge that was going to be a real threat to their potential bottom line moving forward, were Wills to defeat Jack Dempsey. So that's why we continue to see the talk of the fight, the calling for the fight, just linger on to the point where, much like in recent times, with, say, for instance, with even right now with Crawford Spence, much like it was with Mayweather versus Pacquiao, so on and so forth. You can keep going on. It eventually got to a point where, okay, is this at such a peak and high demand for 2-3 years, and many didn't think that two or 3 years would turn into 4 or 5 years, and that essentially was the case here, as we continue to look for and seek that heavyweight title clash between Wills and Dempsey. And of course, time waits for no man. And of course, if you stick around long enough, you continue fighting, you're going to reach the point where you're no longer the fighter that you were. And we've seen how some people have waited out champions, and I don't even have to name names, but we know that some fighters can be very selective as it relates to when they fight a particular person. And this was essentially kind of the case with Wills, and for whatever it may be, had they even fought when it got to the point, and I know we haven't necessarily got there yet, but 1925 was probably the closest point they were going to get to, or the closest point in which the fight was going to be made. And even at that particular point, it certainly wasn't going to be the same type of fight it would have been had it been 1920, 1919, 1921, even 1922 or 1918. But of course, that was prior to Dempsey getting the title. But we'll just say 1919. But 1919 to 1922, heck, even 23. I mean, yeah, it wasn't going to be the same fight in 1925 as it was going to be in these premier years for not only Wills, but for even Dempsey. I think we have to throw him in the mix as well. He probably wouldn't have been the same fighter, and as we saw, he really wasn't the same fighter once he got from I would say from 1925 on as well. I mean, when he fought Tunney in 26 and 27, I believe it was, he had been out for a good period, and even at that particular point around 1925, even for Harry Wills, he started to fight a little bit less often. I mean, he had put in so much work against the top guys that were out there in these years that we're seeing here on the screen that, of course, I mean, it's not going to be sustainable for every fighter. That's what makes a guy like Sam Langford different, and why you see him rated as highly as he's rated, because even well past it, yeah, Langford was still in there fighting guys he shouldn't have been fighting realistically. But hey, he was one of those kind of rare breeds where he didn't really care, and it was partially money, partially legacy. Probably there on that tail end, more the money stuff for Langford even, but he was still fighting guys that he likely shouldn't have been fighting, and it eventually just got to a point where even for Harry Wills, while he was putting in all that good work, it eventually came less and less. And as Random Acoustic Thoughts mentioned, and it's something I didn't mention in a video I did on my page. Yeah, he actually did pretty well with his money. So he wasn't one of those guys who kind of got it and then blew it. He invested well. I believe he had money in real estate, and that helped him. So he actually lived a pretty good life outside of the ring at that point of retirement, because he had money saved and he had invested it well. So I think that kind of played into why he probably didn't he ultimately didn't just continue going on well past this prime like we saw with some of the other fighters that are out there for sure.
Yeah, well put. Now, as it happens, I'm running low on time. I think it's a good, like, I'd like to, if you're open to it, Josh, we do a part 3. And
yeah, why not?
Talk a little bit more in detail about his great rivalries with these other heavyweights who are also denied shots. I'll isolate those on their own slides, and then talk about his later career, maybe a little bit about his post-fight career. I mean, his post-career life.
Yeah.
But Harry Wills, you know, he, in this internet age, he's going to get more credit because people can assemble more information in one place easily, so you can cut through some of the myth. And his run was quite remarkable. And yeah, probably 1920, Dempsey Wills 1920 would have been one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time,
without a doubt.
But because that was when Wills was razor sharp. He was dominating everyone else, just like Dempsey. Leading up to the year before his title shot. So his title shot was well timed. Wills, unfortunately, he kept, like you said, he kept going, man. He stayed busy, but then by the time they were ready for the fight, they waited him out almost. like the money to risk ratio wasn't suddenly looking more appealing. But that's how the sport goes. Look at the heavyweight champions of recent years. A lot of them just kind of sit around, talking stuff, interacting with people. I mean, it's a different kind of entertainment, but that's not a new thing. Champions sitting around or not always doing the top fights is by no means a new thing. That's another reason to celebrate the great. We're gonna have to do a show on the great Muhammad Ali, because there are so many great things to admire about him as a competitor. But definitely a part 3 is coming for Wills. I'm gonna call it because I actually need time to drive there to work. But I want to thank everyone for listening, and look for part 3 sometime within a week. Hopefully, we'll have to check the boxing and MMA schedule to see what some time we can carve out in between our fandom. But Josh, thanks so much for joining, man, and speaking so eloquently on this. It's very sort of interesting texture of the sport at this time, because it was going through an explosion. Oh, big up, Nick. Shout out to Haplo. But yeah, this is great, Josh. I always love having you on, and we'll definitely usually we go a little longer than this, but I'm on a little more extra time constraint today. But thanks, folks, for listening. Go back and check out part 1. I guess I'll put it in the description for this in a few minutes here, or maybe later tonight. And look for part 3. We'll isolate some of these great rivalries Wills had on his way up. So thanks, everybody, and have a great night. Thanks again, Josh.
Thanks.